On the night of October 3rd, 2012, a documentary aired on ITV that should never have needed to exist. The man at the center of it had been dead for almost exactly a year. He had died as one of the most celebrated figures in British public life. He had raised £40 million for charity. He had been knighted. He had been given a papal knighthood. He had shaken hands with prime ministers and royalty. And in the weeks after that documentary aired, more than 450 people contacted police. The question the documentary asked was simple. How did Jimmy Savile do this for 60 years without ever being stopped? Because the answer is not Jimmy Savile. The answer is everyone around him. Before we can name the people who enabled Jimmy Savile, we need to understand exactly what they enabled and for how long. James Wilson. Vincent Savile was born in Leeds in 1926. By the early 1960s, he was one of the most recognized faces in Britain. He hosted Top of the Pops from its very first episode in 1964. He ran Jim'll Fix It for nearly 2 decades. He raised extraordinary sums for charity, most prominently for Stoke Mandeville Hospital and Leeds General Infirmary. He completed over 200 marathons. He was, as far as the British public were concerned, a national institution. And underneath all of it, running through his entire public life, he was one of the most prolific sex offenders Britain has ever produced. The official investigations that followed his death in 2011 identified 214 people who made formal complaints to police. Researchers believe the true number of victims runs into the hundreds more. The youngest victim identified was 8 years old. The oldest was 47. He abused in BBC studios, in hospitals, in care homes, at children's events, in his own caravan. The abuse spanned from the 1950s to the 2000s. 60 years. Nobody stopped him for 60 years. And that is what this video is about. Not the crimes themselves. We are not here to detail what Jimmy Savile did, because that story has been told, and it is harrowing enough. We are here to talk about everyone else. The executives who looked away, the editors who buried the story, the managers who handed him keys to locked wards, the police who investigated and then quietly closed the case, the politicians who championed him. We are here to name them. Part 1. The BBC. In the Jimmy Savile story, one institution's name will be permanently attached: the BBC. That is not unfair. The BBC was not simply the place where Savile worked. It was the place where warnings were heard, considered, and dismissed repeatedly over decades. In 2016, the BBC commissioned Dame Janet Smith to conduct an independent review into what the corporation knew about Savile's behavior during his time there. The review took 3 years. It examined thousands of documents and interviewed hundreds of witnesses. The findings were not comfortable reading. The review found 72 people who said they had been the victim of Savile's behavior while at the BBC. It found that multiple members of staff had witnessed or heard about his conduct, including groping and inappropriate behavior toward young people, and had not reported it. And it found that the reason they did not report it came down to one thing: the culture. The BBC in the 1970s and the 1980s operated what Dame Janet Smith described as a culture in which talent was protected above almost everything else. High-earning, high-profile presenters existed in a world where challenge was unwelcome, where complaints were filtered out before they reached anyone senior enough to act on them, and where the institutional instinct was always to protect the program and the name attached to it, rather than investigate the complaint beneath it. Savile exploited this perfectly. He understood that his value to the BBC was a kind of armor. As long as the programs ran and the ratings held, he was effectively untouchable. But the Janet Smith Review did not simply describe a faceless cultural failure. It named individuals. Roger Ordish produced Jim'll Fix It for much of its run. The Janet Smith Review found that Ordish had been aware of rumors about Savile's behavior with young people. Ordish himself gave evidence to the review. He acknowledged that he had heard things, though he disputed the characterization of what he had been told and the conclusions drawn from it. The review found that, whatever precise formulation of knowledge he had, the complaints that came to those around Savile during those years were not meaningfully escalated. Jim'll Fix It ran until 1994. Savile's access to young fans through that program, unsupervised, in his dressing room and on set, was a documented feature of his offending. And the producer of the program was aware, to some degree, that concerns existed. Esther Ranson's position in the Savile story is one of its more complicated chapters. Ranson was not only a BBC presenter who worked alongside Savile during his years at the corporation. She was also the founder of Childline, a charity whose entire purpose was to give abused children a voice. In 2012, in an interview with BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour, Ranson admitted that she had heard rumors about Savile. She said she had heard things that, in retrospect, she should have taken more seriously. She said, specifically, that people in the industry talked, and that the talk had included Savile's name. She said she regretted not doing more. That is, to her credit, a more honest response than many of her contemporaries offered. But the fact that the founder of Childline heard industry rumors about a man who was abusing children, and the rumors were so normalized that they did not produce a formal complaint, tells you a great deal about how completely Savile's reputation had insulated him from accountability. But the most consequential failure at the BBC did not happen in the 1970s or the 1980s. It happened in 2011. In late 2011, two journalists at Newsnight, reporter Liz McKean and producer Marion Jones, had compiled an investigation into Jimmy Savile. They had spoken to multiple women who said Savile had abused them at Duncroft-approved school in Surrey during the 1970s. They had testimony. They had a substantial piece of journalism ready to broadcast. The investigation was due to air in December 2011, around the same time the BBC was preparing two separate tribute programs celebrating Savile's life, broadcast in the Christmas schedule following his death that October. The Newsnight investigation was never broadcast. The editor of Newsnight at the time was Peter Rippon. Rippon decided not to run the investigation. His stated reason, given in a blog post published after the story of the spiked investigation became public in 2012, was that the piece did not meet the evidential threshold required. He said the police angle of the investigation, which had focused on Surrey Police's earlier handling of complaints about Savile, was what the item was built around, and that it was not sufficiently developed. Liz McKean and Marion Jones disputed this account directly and publicly. McKean told The Guardian that the piece was not about the police investigation, it was about the women. It was about what they said Savile had done to them. She said it was ready to broadcast. Rippon was put on extended leave in October 2012 when the scandal broke publicly. He eventually left the BBC. But the question of what Rippon knew, and who else at the BBC knew, did not end with him. Mark Thompson was the Director General of the BBC from 2004 until September 2012. He left the BBC shortly before the full scale of the Savile scandal became public. He went on to become chief executive of the New York Times Company. The Pollard Review, a separate BBC-commissioned inquiry specifically into the Newsnight affair, found that Thompson had been informed about the Newsnight investigation by the BBC's head of news, Helen Bowden, in December 2011, the same month it was spiked. Thompson acknowledged he had been told something about a Newsnight investigation involving Savile. He denied being told the full nature of what the investigation contained. The Pollard Review found Thompson's account of what he had and had not been told not convincing. Mark Thompson denied any wrongdoing. He was not subject to any formal sanction. Helen Bowden, who as head of news had briefed Thompson, was moved to a different role during the internal investigations. She also subsequently left the BBC. What the Newsnight story represents is not simply one editorial decision gone wrong. It represents the moment where an institution that had enabled Savile for decades had the opportunity to expose him posthumously, and instead, for reasons that have never been made fully transparent, chose not to. The tribute programs ran at Christmas 2011 as scheduled. The women who had spoken to Liz McKean and Marion Jones waited another year before their accounts were finally heard on ITV, on a different channel by a different broadcaster. And then there was Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall worked at the BBC for decades as a sports presenter, most recognizably on It's a Knockout. In 2013, following Operation U-Tree, Hall was convicted of 13 counts of indecent assault on girls as young as 9, committed between 1967 and 1985. He was later convicted of further offenses. Hall and Savile were colleagues. They worked at the same corporation, in the same era, with the same access to young fans and backstage spaces. The fact that two prolific sex offenders operated simultaneously within the BBC, both with access to children, both protected for decades by institutional culture, is not a coincidence. It is a description of an environment. Part 2. The hospitals. Of all the institutions that enabled Jimmy Savile, the National Health Service, the NHS, represents perhaps the most straightforward institutional failure. The BBC's failure involved culture, editorial judgment, and questions about what constituted proof. The failure of the NHS was more literal. They gave him the keys. In 2015, a major NHS investigation led by Kate Lampard examined Savile's activities across the health service. The report found evidence of abuse at 28 NHS trusts. 41 hospitals in total were examined. The scale of what it uncovered was extraordinary. Savile had not simply visited hospitals as a charity fundraiser, though that was how it was presented to the public and to the hospital administrators who enabled him. He had made hospitals a core part of his offending. He had used his charitable reputation to gain access to wards, to patients, to mortuary facilities, and to vulnerable people who had no ability to challenge him or report what he did. Stoke Mandeville Hospital in Aylesbury was the institution most closely associated with Savile's charity work. He raised millions of pounds for the spinal injuries unit there. In return, he was given something far beyond a donor's usual relationship with a hospital. He was given a caravan on site. Savile lived in that caravan during periods of his work for the hospital. He had free movement across the site. He had access to wards at night. Patients, many of whom were severely injured and entirely dependent on the care they received, were among his victims. The NHS investigation found that Savile had abused patients, volunteers, and a member of staff at Stoke Mandeville. The abuse took place across multiple decades. The senior management of Stoke Mandeville Hospital allowed this. They welcomed his presence. They valued his fundraising, and the price of that fundraising was borne by people in hospital beds who could not defend themselves. At Leeds General Infirmary, the relationship between Savile and hospital management went even further. The hospital not only allowed him extensive access, it gave him a porter's uniform and an unofficial porter's role. He wheeled patients around the hospital. He had access to wards at almost any time. The hospital named a ward after him while he was still alive. Leeds General Infirmary was Savile's local hospital. He was born in Leeds. He maintained a flat in Leeds throughout his life. The LGI was part of his personal fiefdom, a place where his generosity and his celebrity had transformed into almost unlimited, unmonitored access. The NHS investigation confirmed that abuse took place at the LGI. Of all the hospitals implicated in the Savile story, Broadmoor carries a particular weight, because Broadmoor is not an ordinary hospital. Broadmoor is a high-security psychiatric hospital. Its patients include some of the most dangerous and the most vulnerable people in the British mental health system. Access to Broadmoor is tightly controlled. It has to be, except apparently where Jimmy Savile was concerned. In the early 1980s, Savile was appointed to a task force intended to advise on management improvements at Broadmoor. The exact nature of his involvement and the process by which he came to have it have been the subject of considerable scrutiny. What is established is that Savile ended up with a significant degree of authority and access at the hospital that went far beyond any advisory role. He held keys to parts of the hospital. There are accounts of him spending nights in the hospital. Staff described a situation in which a television celebrity with no clinical qualifications had acquired an influence at a secure psychiatric institution that ordinary oversight mechanisms appeared unable to challenge. The authorization for Savile's role at Broadmoor reached into government. The relevant minister at the time was Edwina Currie, who held a junior health role in Thatcher's government. Currie has said publicly that she was aware of the decision to involve Savile at Broadmoor and raised no objection. She has since described this as a mistake and has said she was not aware of what Savile was doing in the hospital. But someone in government approved it. Someone in the Department of Health decided that a disc jockey and charity fundraiser with no medical training should be given influence over the running of one of Britain's most secure psychiatric facilities. The Lampard investigation found evidence of abuse at Broadmoor. The victims there were patients in a secure psychiatric hospital. They were, by definition, among the most vulnerable people in the country. The institutions that gave Savile access to them did so because he raised money, because he was famous, because he was convenient, and because nobody at any level of any of those hospital management structures asked the question that should have been asked about any adult who sought unsupervised access to hospital wards, patients, and the vulnerable. Why does he want to be here? Part 3. The Police. By the time Jimmy Savile died in October 2011, the police had investigated him at least twice. Neither investigation resulted in charges, and the story of why they did not is one of the most significant chapters in the entire Savile story. In 2007, Surrey police began investigating allegations about Jimmy Savile. The investigation arose from complaints made by women who said he had abused them at Duncroft-approved school in Surrey during the 1970s. It is the same set of allegations that Liz McKean and Miriam Jones would later investigate for Newsnight. Surrey police carried out the investigation over 2 years. interviewing multiple women who said they had been abused by Savile. In 2009, they submitted a file to the Crown Prosecution Service. The Crown Prosecution Service decided not to prosecute. The Crown Prosecution Service's stated reason was insufficient evidence. The women's accounts were deemed unlikely to secure a conviction given the time that had elapsed and the difficulty of corroboration in cases of historical abuse. This is a judgment that the Crown Prosecution Service and Surrey Police have since, in various terms, acknowledged as a failure. Not because the legal threshold for prosecution is wrong, but because the investigation was not pursued with the rigor that the volume and credibility of the allegations warranted. Multiple women spoke to Surrey Police. They were not strangers to each other. They gave accounts that, when examined together, showed a consistent pattern of behavior in a specific location over a specific period. The investigation was closed. Duncroft. Approved School was itself an institution that failed its residents. The girls who lived there in the 1970s were already vulnerable. They were in state care. They had limited resources to seek help, limited credibility with authorities, and no obvious avenue for complaint. Several of them reported Savile's behavior to staff at the school at the time. The accounts of what happened to those reports is contested, but no formal complaint was ever made by the school on behalf of its residents. The women who had been residents at Duncroft spent decades attempting to have their accounts heard. In 2007, they were heard by Surrey Police. In 2009, the case was closed. In 2012, they appeared on ITV. But Surrey Police was not the only force that had encountered Savile before his death. West Yorkshire Police, in Savile's home territory of Leeds, received complaints and information about him on multiple occasions over the years. The force was the subject of scrutiny in the post-death investigations for its handling of these reports. The picture that emerged was one of informal information that was not followed up, complaints that were not formally recorded, and an environment in which Savile's status as a local celebrity and philanthropist created an implicit deference that made formal investigation feel, to those who received the information, like an unlikely undertaking. Savile was not simply famous in Leeds, he was beloved in Leeds. He had raised money for its hospitals, he was seen jogging through its streets, he appeared at its events. He had relationships with senior figures in the city, including reportedly relationships with senior police officers through his charity work. That informal proximity between Savile and the institution that should have been investigating him is not a minor detail. It is one of the central reasons he was never stopped. When an investigation into a suspect depends on the willingness of an institution to overcome its own cultural familiarity with that suspect, the investigation is compromised before it begins. In Leeds, that familiarity was total. Part 4. The Establishment. The institutions we have discussed so far, the BBC, the NHS, the police, are all large, diffuse, capable of shelter via bureaucracy. The failures within them can be attributed to culture, to process, to the absence of clear accountability. The failures we are about to discuss are harder to distribute. They sit with named individuals at the highest levels of British public life. Jimmy Savile received a knighthood in the Queen's Birthday Honours of 1990. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister until November of that year. The honours list on which Savile's name appeared was compiled during her tenure, but the story of how that knighthood came about begins years earlier. Government records released under the Freedom of Information Act confirmed that Savile was put forward for a knighthood on at least 3 separate occasions before 1990, and that each time the nomination was blocked. The reasons were recorded in civil service shorthand as concerns about the nominee's personal life. The cabinet secretary at the time is reported to have told Thatcher's office directly that Savile was not suitable for a knighthood. Margaret Thatcher pushed for his nomination regardless. The archive makes clear that this was not a case of a prime minister being unaware of concerns. Concerns were raised to her directly. She dismissed them. She had a personal warmth toward Savile, who had visited Chequers on 11 separate occasions, more than any other entertainer. The nature of those visits, the informality of the relationship, the way Savile had positioned himself as a kind of unofficial confidant to the Prime Minister, is a documented feature of his life that has received, in the public reckoning after his death, insufficient attention. Savile was not simply a name on an honours list for Thatcher. He was a regular presence. He was trusted. He was championed. And when her advisors told her there were concerns, she continued to push for his recognition anyway. The knighthood was granted in 1990. Margaret Thatcher died in 2013. She was never questioned in any formal process about her role in enabling Savile. Jimmy Savile's relationship with the royal family is a documented fact that has been handled cautiously by almost everyone who has discussed it, for understandable reasons. But caution is not the same as silence. Savile was a personal friend of Prince Charles. That friendship is established through correspondence released after Savile's death, which showed Charles writing warmly to Savile and, on one notable occasion, asking for his advice on personal matters. Savile was involved with Charles's charitable work. He attended events at Kensington Palace. The question of what Charles knew about Savile's behavior is one that has not been answered definitively in any formal process. Charles has not been implicated in Savile's offending, but he maintained a warm and active friendship with a man whose reputation, even during his lifetime, was known in certain circles to be troubling. The Savile relationship was not peripheral to Charles's public life in the period in question. Savile was visible at his events and publicly associated with his charitable work. The due diligence that should accompany any senior public figure's choice of associates either was not applied or produced results that were ignored. Beyond Westminster and the palace, Savile's network extended into regional public life. One of the clearest examples is Peter Giaconelli, who served as mayor of Scarborough and was a significant figure in the town during the period when Savile had a flat and regular presence there. Giaconelli was himself a prolific paedophile. He was exposed as an abuser after investigations in 2014. North Yorkshire Police, following an independent review, issued an apology acknowledging that their predecessors had failed to properly investigate allegations against Giaconelli for decades. The relationship between Giaconelli and Savile was social and geographic. Two prolific child sex offenders were prominent public figures in the same regional community, both protected by status and connection, and neither investigated meaningfully during their lifetimes. This is not coincidence. This is what an enabling environment looks like at a local level: famous faces, civic status, charity work, and beneath it, a shared impunity. There is one more category of enabler that does not sit within any single institution, but which surrounded Savile throughout his career. It is the British press. Savile's offending was not invisible to the world of journalism. Rumours circulated within Fleet Street for decades. Journalists heard things, sources spoke, and the stories were not written. There are several overlapping answers to that question, and they are worth separating. The first is legal. Britain's libel laws are among the most restrictive in the world. Publishing allegations against a public figure without ironclad evidence Particularly a public figure with the means to pursue litigation was an enormous financial risk for any publisher. Savile was known to be litigious. He had brought and threatened legal actions. The cost of being wrong was potentially catastrophic. The second is cultural. Savile was not simply a celebrity, he was a charity figure. He was associated with the NHS, with disabled children, with sick patients. Any journalist investigating him was not simply taking on a famous man, they were taking on a figure whose public identity was bound up with charitable work, with fundraising, with sick children. The reputational risk of a story that did not stick was not just financial, it was social. And this is the third, and perhaps most important, answer. Savile had constructed, with extraordinary deliberateness, a public persona that was essentially immune from scrutiny. The charity work was not incidental to his offending, it was structural to his protection. It gave him the access, it gave him the shield, it gave him the answer to any question. Why are you spending so much time in hospitals? Because I raise money for them. Why are you on the ward at night? Because I care about patients. Why do you have so many young fans around you? Because young people love charity work. The answer to every question was the charity. And the charity was real. The money was real. And so the question, every time it was considered, retreated. There were journalists who tried. The journalist Anna Raccoon, writing on her blog in the years before the ITV documentary, raised questions about aspects of the Duncroft story that remain contested. The journalist Don Hale, a former editor of the Bury Messenger, has claimed that he was warned off investigating Savile by Special Branch in the 1990s, though this claim has not been officially confirmed. The journalist Nick Fielding is among those who has said the industry heard things that went nowhere. The ITV documentary that finally aired in October 2012, presented by journalist Mark Williams Thomas, was not the product of a major newspaper or a major broadcaster. It was the result of one journalist, one smaller ITV strand, and a group of women who had been trying to be heard for decades. The women who spoke on that documentary had, between them, spoken to Surrey Police, to the BBC, and in some cases to journalists before October 2012. They were not new. Their accounts were not new. The journalism that finally told their story was the reckoning. In the years following October 2012, there were investigations, inquiries, reviews, apologies, and in some cases, consequences. The police launched Operation U-Tree, which investigated not only Savile's crimes, but those of other offenders in related networks. A number of convictions followed for other individuals, including Stuart Hall, Rolf Harris, and others. The BBC commissioned the Janet Smith Review and the Pollard Review. Both found serious institutional failures. Ripon left the BBC. Bowden moved roles. Thompson went to the New York Times. The NHS issued formal apologies through the Lampard Report. Hospital trusts acknowledged failures. Management structures changed. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA, examined Savile as part of its broader investigation into institutional failures in child protection across Britain. It published findings in 2022 identifying systemic failures across multiple institutions. But here is what the reckoning did not produce. No BBC executive was criminally prosecuted for their role in enabling Savile. No NHS manager faced criminal sanction for handing him the keys. No police officer was prosecuted for closing the Surrey investigation. No politician faced legal consequences for championing his honours. The women who spoke at Duncroft, the patients on the wards, the people who were abused in BBC corridors, they were eventually believed. Their accounts are now part of the official record. The investigations confirmed them. The history acknowledges them. But the institutions that failed them, in almost every case, reformed themselves, issued apologies, and continued. The IICS final report noted that the Savile case was the most dramatic example of the way in which institutional culture can enable an individual offender to operate with impunity. It noted that, across every institution implicated, the common feature was not individual malice, but institutional self-interest. Protecting reputations, protecting revenue, protecting programs, protecting names. The common feature was an institution that valued its own continuation more than the safety of the people inside it. Jimmy Savile could not have operated for 60 years without the infrastructure that surrounded him. The television contracts, the hospital access, the charity reputation, the honors, the police files that were closed, the newsroom decisions, the producers who heard things and said nothing, the managers who gave him keys. He needed all of it. The question that every institution in this story eventually faced, usually too late, is the same question. How did we not know? The honest answer, in most cases, is that they did know. In fragments, in rumors, in complaints that went nowhere, in reports that were not followed up. What they did not have was the will to act on it. Because acting on it was complicated. Because he was famous. Because he raised money. Because he was on television. Because the cost of being wrong seemed at the time greater than the cost of doing nothing. That calculus, the one that put institutional comfort ahead of the safety of people in hospital beds, young fans in dressing rooms, vulnerable residents of approved schools, is the story of the Jimmy Savile scandal. The crimes were his. The conditions that made them possible belonged to everyone in this video.